The principal expelled my daughter for disrupting class during the board meeting. She didn't realize my daughter had been recording her racist comments for weeks. Dr. Whitmore pointed at Maya from the board table and said my daughter was expelled effective immediately for creating a hostile learning environment. The 6 board members sat frozen while Maya stood in the center of the room holding her phone. I'd been sitting 3 rows back with the other parents when the principal made her announcement. Maya had just finished presenting evidence of systematic racial discrimination during the public comment period. The board president tried to call for order, but Whitmore talked over him. She said Maya fabricated allegations to avoid academic consequences and that students who disrupted school operations would face severe discipline. Maya's hand stayed steady, holding her phone up where everyone could see the screen. She pressed play on the first recording. Whitmore's voice filled the room through the Bluetooth speaker Maya had connected. These people always want special treatment. Her mother probably threatened to sue. That's what they do. The date stamp showed 3 weeks ago. Board members leaned forward, trying to hear clearly. Whitmore's face drained of color. Maya pressed play on the second recording without waiting for anyone to speak. If Maya spent half as much energy on her homework as she does complaining about imaginary racism, maybe she'd actually pass my evaluations. That one was dated 5 weeks back during a parent-teacher conference I'd attended. I remembered that meeting vividly now. Whitmore had smiled the entire time while suggesting Maya needed to work harder and stop being so sensitive about feedback. Maya had been recording since September when the incident started. It was now February, and she had 34 separate recordings stored on her phone and backed up to 3 different cloud accounts. I didn't know about any of it until yesterday when she showed me everything and asked if I'd support her presenting to the school board. She'd organized the files chronologically with transcripts and context notes. Each recording captured Whitmore saying something racist directly to Maya or about Maya to other staff members. The earliest one was from the 2nd week of school when Whitmore told Maya her natural hair was unprofessional and distracting to other students. Maya had started wearing her hair in braids after that conversation. The braids didn't satisfy Whitmore either. 2 weeks later, she told Maya that ethnic hairstyles belonged at home, not in an academic setting. Maya recorded that conversation too. By October, the comments escalated. Whitmore questioned whether Maya belonged in advanced placement classes, said the accelerated curriculum might be too challenging for someone from her background. Maya had a 3.8 GPA at the time. She'd been taking AP classes since freshman year. Whitmore knew this because she'd personally reviewed Maya's transcripts when she transferred to the school at the start of the year. The school board meeting erupted after the second recording finished. Parents started shouting questions. Board members demanded explanations. Whitmore stood up and declared the meeting over because students were not permitted to record staff members without consent. The board president reminded her that North Carolina is a one-party consent state for recordings. Maya was legally within her rights to record her own conversations. Whitmore's attorney, who'd apparently been sitting in the back row anticipating problems, approached the board table and advised Whitmore to stop talking immediately. Too late. Whitmore was already defending herself by insisting her comments were taken out of context and that Maya was manipulating situations to make herself look like a victim. She said she'd dealt with students using false racism allegations for attention before and wouldn't tolerate it at her school. Maya pressed play on the third recording. This one captured Whitmore speaking to another administrator about Maya's family. Her mother shows up here acting entitled and demanding meetings. You can tell she's one of those people who thinks the world owes her something. I'll bet she's never worked a real job in her life. The administrator's response was audible, too. Should we document these meetings differently, in case there's legal issues later? Whitmore laughed on the recording. Document what? A parent complaining that her daughter isn't being treated like royalty? The board won't care. These families never follow through anyway. I stood up from my seat and walked to where Maya was standing. Put my hand on her shoulder and told the board I'd been at that meeting Whitmore referenced. I'd taken a half-day off from my job as a surgical nurse at Chapel Hill Medical Center to attend. I'd worked at that hospital for 16 years and had never missed a shift without cause. I told the board I'd documented every interaction with the school administration for the past 5 months, had emails, meeting notes, and copies of every complaint I'd submitted through proper channels. The assistant superintendent asked why I hadn't brought concerns directly to the district office. I told her I had. 3 separate times starting in October. Each time I was told to work with the building principal first and use the school's internal resolution process. The assistant superintendent looked uncomfortable and said she had no record of complaints from our family. I pulled out my phone and opened my email, read the dates and times of 3 emails I'd sent to her official district address, showed her the read receipts proving someone opened those emails. The assistant superintendent claimed her office received hundreds of emails daily, and sometimes things got missed. The board president asked his assistant to pull up the district complaint database immediately. The meeting took a 15-minute recess while they searched records. I stayed standing next to Maya, who was still holding her phone. Other parents approached us during the recess. One black mother said her son had been having similar problems with Whitmore, but she hadn't known how to document it. Another parent, a white father, said he'd overheard Whitmore make dismissive comments about minority students, but assumed someone else would report it. The board reconvened and confirmed 0 complaints from our family existed in the official database. Every email I'd sent had been received but never logged or forwarded to the appropriate department. The assistant superintendent blamed a clerical error in her office and said she'd investigate the breakdown in communication. The board president was not satisfied with that answer. He asked if any other families had similar concerns about Dr. Whitmore. 8 parents raised their hands. All of them were Black or Latino families who'd had children in Whitmore's classes or under her administrative supervision over the past 3 years. The board president said they'd open a formal investigation and placed Whitmore on administrative leave effective immediately. Whitmore refused to leave the meeting room. Her attorney physically guided her toward the exit while she shouted that the board was making a mistake and that she'd sue everyone involved for defamation. Maya pressed play on another recording as Whitmore was leaving. This one was particularly damning. Whitmore speaking to the school resource officer about Maya. Keep an eye on that one. Kids from those neighborhoods usually have problems with authority. Probably drugs involved at home. The mom seems normal, but you never know what goes on behind closed doors. The resource officer had apparently pushed back because Whitmore's response was also captured. I've been an educator for 23 years. I know the warning signs. These families are always trouble. The room went completely silent when that recording ended. The resource officer was present at the meeting and stood up immediately to clarify he'd never followed up on Whitmore's suggestions and had found them inappropriate at the time. The board president asked why he hadn't reported the conversation. The officer said he'd assumed it was just stress talking and didn't realize it was part of a pattern. I requested permission to address the board directly. Explained that Maya had transferred to this school because our previous district had a better special programs option, and we'd moved to this area specifically for the schools. Maya had been an honor student her entire academic career, had won state recognition for a science research project in 8th grade, was planning to apply for pre-med programs next year when she started looking at colleges. Dr. Whitmore had systematically undermined Maya's confidence and academic performance from the first week of school. Maya's GPA had dropped from 3.8 to 3.4 since September. She'd withdrawn from 2 AP classes after Whitmore suggested she wasn't capable of the work. She'd stopped participating in class discussions because Whitmore publicly criticized her contributions as aggressive or inappropriate. Maya had developed anxiety severe enough that I'd scheduled appointments with a therapist starting in November. The therapist had documented symptoms consistent with a hostile environment and recommended we consider changing schools. I'd resisted because moving Maya again felt like admitting defeat. Now I understood we should have left months ago. The board president thanked me for the statement and said the district took these allegations extremely seriously, promised a full investigation with findings made public within 30 days. I said 30 days wasn't acceptable. My daughter had been expelled from school that evening based on false allegations. The expulsion needed to be reversed immediately and in writing. The board attorney huddled with the president and vice president for several minutes. They announced the expulsion was rescinded and Maya would return to school on Monday with no disciplinary record of tonight's events. Dr. Whitmore would remain on administrative leave during the investigation. A substitute administrator would manage the building. The meeting ended around 10 p.m. Maya and I walked to our car in silence. She'd held herself together during the entire presentation, but started crying the moment we were alone. I held her in the parking lot while she sobbed and apologized for not telling me sooner about the recordings. I asked why she'd waited so long. Maya said she needed to be sure, needed enough evidence that no one could dismiss her claims as misunderstandings or sensitivity. She'd watched other students complain about teachers and get labeled as troublemakers, watched administrators close ranks around staff members accused of misconduct. She didn't want to become another black student written off as playing the race card, so she documented everything methodically and carefully, built an airtight case before bringing it forward. I told her I was proud of her courage, but heartbroken she'd felt so alone. Maya said she hadn't been entirely alone. Her English teacher, Miss Liu, had noticed Maya's confidence declining and pulled her aside in December to ask what was wrong. Maya had shared some of what was happening without mentioning the recordings. Miss Liu advised her to document everything and offered to serve as a witness if needed. She'd also apparently spoken to other teachers about Whitmore's behavior toward minority students. 3 teachers had begun keeping their own documentation of concerning interactions they'd witnessed. Miss Liu planned to submit a formal complaint to the board before Maya decided to present her evidence publicly. We drove home and I stayed up until 3 a.m. listening to all 34 recordings, each one worse than the last. Whitmore questioning Maya's intelligence, her work ethic, her family background, her place at the school. Suggesting Maya was only succeeding because of affirmative action or lowered standards. implying Maya's presence in advanced classes took opportunities from more deserving students. The recordings also captured Whitmore speaking about other minority students with similar disdain. She called one Latino student's family illegal immigrants who should be grateful for any education they received, told a black male student he was headed for prison if he didn't learn to follow rules better, asked an Asian student if her parents had written her college essay because it was too sophisticated for a teenager. Every comment delivered with casual cruelty when she thought no adults were listening. Some recordings included responses from other students or staff members. Most stayed silent or offered weak protests that Whitmore ignored. A few laughed or agreed with her assessments. By morning, I had a list of 12 other students who appeared in the recordings as either targets of Whitmore's comments or witnesses to them. I spent Friday contacting their families. Some already knew about the board meeting through social media or community networks. Others were hearing about the situation for the first time. 6 families agreed to file formal complaints with the district within the next week. 3 families declined to participate out of fear of retaliation. 2 families couldn't be reached. One family's mother thanked me for calling but said her son had graduated in December and she didn't want to revisit the trauma he'd experienced under Whitmore's administration. The local news picked up the story by Friday afternoon. A reporter had attended the board meeting for routine coverage and ended up with the lead story for the weekend. The segment included excerpts from Maya's recordings played on air with permission. Also included interviews with the board president who confirmed an investigation was underway and that Dr. Whitmore was on administrative leave. By Saturday morning, the story had gone regional. National education policy organizations started calling me for interviews. Civil rights groups offered legal assistance. The superintendent called Saturday afternoon to schedule a meeting Monday morning before school resumed. I told him Maya and I would attend with legal representation. He sounded surprised and asked if that was necessary. I said yes. He'd allowed Dr. Whitmore to operate unchecked for years despite warning signs. His office had failed to properly handle complaints. His assistant superintendent had failed to log or investigate concerns raised by multiple families. The district needed to understand we were taking this seriously and expected systemic changes, not just individual accountability. The superintendent agreed to the meeting and said he'd have the district's attorney present as well. I contacted the civil rights attorney who'd reached out Friday evening. Her name was Keisha Grant, and she'd built a reputation handling education discrimination cases throughout the Southeast. She reviewed Maya's recordings and my documentation over the weekend, said we had an extremely strong case not just against Whitmore, but against the district for failing to address a hostile environment they'd been made aware of multiple times. She offered to represent us pro bono given the public interest implications. I accepted immediately. Monday's meeting included me, Maya, Attorney Grant, the superintendent, the assistant superintendent, the district's attorney, and the board president. We sat in the superintendent's conference room for 2 hours reviewing evidence and discussing next steps. The superintendent opened by apologizing for the district's failure to protect Maya and other students. He said Dr. Whitmore would not return to any school in the district and her contract would be terminated as soon as the investigation concluded. The board president added that they'd discovered irregularities in how complaints were processed district-wide. The assistant superintendent's office had apparently screened incoming concerns and determined which ones warranted escalation to the superintendent or board. Many complaints from minority families had been marked as resolved at the building level without verification that any resolution actually occurred. The assistant superintendent attempted to defend the screening process as necessary given limited resources and high complaint volumes. Attorney Grant asked how many complaints involving racial discrimination had been screened out in the past 3 years. The assistant superintendent said she'd need to pull detailed records but estimated maybe a dozen. Attorney Grant suggested the number was likely much higher based on preliminary conversations with other families in the district. The superintendent looked physically ill hearing this information. He asked his attorney what exposure the district faced. The attorney said substantial if the pattern of ignored complaints could be documented. Attorney Grant laid out our terms. Maya's record would be completely clean with no mention of the expulsion or board meeting incident. The district would provide a written apology acknowledging systemic failures. Dr. Whitmore would be terminated with cause and the termination reasons made public. The assistant superintendent would be placed on administrative leave pending review of her office's complaint handling practices. The district would implement mandatory anti-racism training for all administrators and teachers starting immediately. An independent third party would audit the complaint process and recommend reforms. The district would fund counseling services for any student affected by Dr. Whitmore's conduct. And finally, the district would agree to a consent decree monitored by the State Department of Education for 3 years, ensuring compliance with civil rights requirements. The superintendent tried to negotiate the terms, particularly around the consent decree, which would bring significant state oversight. Attorney Grant said the terms were non-negotiable. We could either settle with the district agreeing to reforms, or we could file a federal civil rights lawsuit that would be far more costly and public. The district attorney advised accepting the terms. The superintendent agreed and said he'd present the proposal to the school board that evening. The board approved everything in a special session attended by over 200 community members. Dr. Whitmore's termination was announced publicly along with the reasons, including documented evidence of racist conduct toward students and failure to maintain professional standards. The assistant superintendent was placed on administrative leave pending further investigation into her office's practices. 3 other administrators who'd been aware of complaints against Whitmore but failed to act were given formal reprimands. The district issued a public apology to our family and any other families affected by their failures. Local news covered the board's actions extensively. National outlets picked up the story by midweek. Dr. Whitmore hired a crisis management firm and released a statement denying all allegations and claiming she was the victim of a coordinated attack by families with academic grievances. The statement backfired spectacularly. More families came forward with their own stories of Whitmore's discrimination. Former students from schools where she'd previously worked contacted journalists with similar accounts going back over a decade. Whitmore's reputation was destroyed within 2 weeks. She retained an attorney and threatened to sue the district for wrongful termination. The district's attorney sent her Maya's recordings and documentation from 17 other families. Whitmore's attorney withdrew from the case and she quietly left the state. Maya returned to school with a different principal and immediate adjustments to her schedule. The new principal, Mr. Stevens, had been promoted from assistant principal at another school in the district. He met with Maya personally and asked what support she needed to feel safe and successful. Maya requested schedule changes to avoid certain teachers who'd been complicit in Whitmore's behavior, requested weekly check-ins with a counselor to process the trauma, requested that her recordings be used as teaching examples in the mandatory anti-racism training. Mr. Stevens approved all requests. Maya's GPA recovered to 3.7 by the end of the spring semester. She rejoined the science research club she'd quit in December, started applying to summer pre-med programs at universities interested in recruiting students from underrepresented backgrounds. Her anxiety decreased significantly with Whitmore gone and a supportive administration in place. The district hired an independent consulting firm to audit complaint processes. Their report, released in May, found that over 50 complaints involving potential discrimination had been improperly handled or dismissed in the previous 4 years. The majority involved families of color raising concerns about treatment of their children. The consulting firm recommended a complete overhaul of how the district received, tracked, and investigated complaints. Recommended creating an independent ombudsman position to handle civil rights concerns separately from the general administrative structure. Recommended mandatory training for all staff on recognizing and responding to discrimination. The board adopted all recommendations and budgeted funding for implementation starting the following school year. The assistant superintendent resigned rather than face further scrutiny of her role in the failures. 2 other central office administrators retired early, citing personal reasons. Miss Liu, the English teacher who'd supported Maya, was recognized by the board for her willingness to speak up about concerning behavior. Several other teachers who'd kept documentation came forward after Whitmore's termination and shared what they'd witnessed. Some admitted they'd been afraid to report concerns earlier because Whitmore had significant influence with the previous superintendent and a reputation for retaliating against staff who questioned her. The teachers' union issued a statement acknowledging that fear of retaliation had created a culture of silence and committed to supporting members who reported discrimination going forward. The resource officer who'd been mentioned in one of Maya's recordings requested a transfer to another school district. He submitted a resignation letter that included an apology for not reporting Whitmore's comments when he first heard them. The letter was published in the local newspaper as part of the ongoing coverage. He wrote that he'd failed in his duty to protect students and hoped other school resource officers would learn from his mistakes. The story generated discussions about the role of school police and whether their presence created additional barriers for students trying to report discrimination. The district eventually decided to transition away from having armed officers in schools and instead hired behavioral health specialists to handle student safety concerns. The change was controversial and took 2 years to fully implement, but became a model that other districts studied. Attorney Grant helped me understand the broader implications of what Maya had documented. The recordings didn't just expose one racist principal. They exposed systemic failures at multiple levels. A district leadership that didn't take discrimination seriously. A complaint process designed to minimize rather than address concerns. A professional culture where teachers felt unable to advocate for students without risking their careers. Grant encouraged me to think about policy changes beyond our immediate situation. I started attending board meetings regularly and joined a parent advocacy coalition focused on educational equity. We pushed for changes to discipline policies that disproportionately affected students of color. advocated for curriculum changes that included more diverse perspectives, demanded transparency in how the district tracked student outcomes by race and socioeconomic status. Some board members welcomed the activism. Others saw us as troublemakers who wanted to undermine traditional school values. The community divided along predictable lines. Some residents praised the district for taking action against Whitmore and implementing reforms. Others claimed the district had overreacted to appease activists and created an environment where teachers couldn't maintain discipline. Local social media groups devolved into arguments about critical race theory and whether schools were teaching students to see racism everywhere. I ignored most of the online debate and focused on tangible changes that would actually help students. Maya became something of a reluctant activist herself. She was invited to speak at education conferences about student advocacy and documentation of discrimination. Initially hesitant, she eventually agreed to share her story at a regional conference for school administrators. Her presentation included excerpts from her recordings and specific recommendations for creating environments where students felt empowered to report concerns without fear. The conference attendees gave her a standing ovation. Several administrators approached her afterward to ask for advice on implementing student feedback mechanisms at their own schools. The following school year brought visible changes. The new complaint ombudsman position was filled by a retired civil rights attorney with decades of experience investigating discrimination claims. She established a confidential reporting hotline and online portal where students and families could submit concerns directly without going through building administrators. Within the first semester, the ombudsman received 23 complaints requiring investigation. Most were resolved through mediation or corrective action. 3 resulted in formal disciplinary measures against staff members. The transparency in handling complaints began rebuilding trust that had been badly damaged. Mandatory anti-racism training for all staff happened over the summer before school started. The district brought in national experts to facilitate sessions on recognizing implicit bias, responding to microaggressions, and creating inclusive classroom environments. Maya's recordings were used as case studies with her permission. Hearing actual examples of how discrimination manifested in everyday interactions made the training more concrete and impactful than generic presentations would have been. Some teachers embraced the training and immediately began examining their own practices. Others resented being required to attend and complained about political correctness infiltrating education. The district made clear that participation was mandatory, and failure to implement equitable practices would result in professional consequences. Several teachers who couldn't or wouldn't adjust to the new expectations left the district voluntarily. Others improved their practice after receiving coaching and support. The district also revised curriculum to include more diverse voices and perspectives across all subjects. The English department expanded reading lists to include authors from various cultural backgrounds. Social studies classes incorporated units on systemic racism and civil rights movements. Science classes highlighted contributions from scientists of color who'd been historically excluded from textbooks. Math teachers learned to incorporate culturally relevant examples in word problems and applications. The changes were gradual but meaningful. Maya thrived academically with the hostile environment removed. She finished her junior year with a 3.9 GPA and scored exceptionally well on standardized tests. Started receiving recruitment letters from universities across the country. Narrowed her college choices to schools with strong pre-med programs and commitments to diversity. She applied to 12 schools and was accepted to 10, including several Ivy League institutions. Ultimately chose a university known for its biomedical research and significant scholarship support. The scholarship covered full tuition and included funding for summer research opportunities. Maya graduated high school with honors in the top 5% of her class. Gave a speech at graduation about speaking up against injustice even when it's frightening. Thanked me publicly for supporting her and Miss Liu for believing her. Thanked her classmates who'd stood with her and shared their own stories. Encouraged incoming students to document concerns and advocate for themselves. The speech received a standing ovation from most of the audience. A small group of parents sat with arms crossed and didn't applaud. I noticed and didn't care. Their discomfort was a small price for the changes we'd fought for. After graduation, local media did a follow-up story on Maya and the reforms that had resulted from her courage. The reporter interviewed the superintendent, who acknowledged that Maya's documentation had forced the district to confront problems they'd ignored for too long. He said the changes implemented over the past year had created a stronger, more equitable educational system. Admitted there was still work to do, but credited student and parent advocates for holding the district accountable. The story also included an update on Dr. Whitmore. She'd been hired by a small private school in another state but terminated within months after parents there discovered her history. She was reportedly no longer working in education. I felt satisfaction knowing she couldn't harm more students. Attorney Grant stayed involved with our family beyond the initial settlement. She helped establish a legal clinic at a local law school focused on education rights. Law students worked under supervision to assist families navigating discrimination complaints and special education disputes. The clinic provided free legal services to families who couldn't afford representation, held monthly workshops teaching parents how to document concerns, file complaints, and advocate effectively for their children. Maya volunteered with the clinic during summer breaks from college, used her experience to help other students understand their rights and build cases when they faced discrimination. One family she worked with had a daughter experiencing similar treatment to what Maya had endured. The student was a freshman being told by her teachers that she wasn't prepared for college prep courses despite strong middle school performance. Her teachers repeatedly suggested she'd be happier in less rigorous classes, implied her family didn't value education based on stereotypes about their immigrant background. The family had complained to the principal, who dismissed their concerns. Maya taught the student how to document interactions with school staff, helped her mother understand the complaint process and connect with the clinic attorneys. The clinic filed a formal complaint that resulted in the student being returned to college prep classes with an apology from the school. The student flourished once given appropriate support and challenge. Later thanked Maya for showing her how to fight back against low expectations. Stories like that motivated Maya to consider education law as a potential career path alongside medicine. She talked about wanting to be both a doctor and an advocate, understood that health and education were interconnected, and that students facing discrimination often experienced health consequences from the chronic stress. The consent decree monitoring by the State Department of Education continued for 3 years as agreed. State reviewers visited the district quarterly to assess implementation of reforms, reviewed complaint data, interviewed students and families, observed training sessions, and evaluated whether changes were substantive or performative. Their reports were generally positive, noting significant improvements in how the district handled discrimination concerns. Noted areas still needing work, including disparities in discipline rates and achievement gaps between white students and students of color. The district used the feedback to make additional adjustments, created a district-level equity team to analyze data and recommend interventions, hired more teachers and administrators of color to increase representation, partnered with community organizations to provide wraparound supports for students facing economic or social barriers to success. By the 3rd year of monitoring, the State Department found the district in substantial compliance with civil rights requirements, recommended the consent decree be lifted, but that voluntary monitoring continue for an additional 2 years. The board agreed. The superintendent who'd been in place when Maya presented her evidence retired at the end of the consent decree period. The board hired a new superintendent with experience in urban districts and a track record of closing achievement gaps. She came in with ambitious goals for continuing the equity work that had begun with Maya's courage. I attended her welcome reception and introduced myself, told her briefly about Maya's case and the reforms it had triggered. She'd actually heard about the situation during the interview process and said it was part of why she'd been interested in the position. Wanted to work in a district that had demonstrated willingness to confront systemic problems even when it was uncomfortable. Other families in neighboring districts heard about Maya's story and reached out for advice. I connected them with Attorney Grant and the legal clinic resources, shared lessons we'd learned about documentation, persistence, and building coalitions. Some families faced situations as egregious as what Maya had endured. Others dealt with subtler forms of discrimination that were harder to prove but equally damaging. All of them needed support and validation that their concerns were legitimate. The Parent Advocacy Coalition expanded to include members from multiple districts. We coordinated on policy recommendations and shared successful strategies, organized workshops on recognizing discrimination and navigating complaint systems, invited legal experts and civil rights organizations to present on student rights, built a network of families willing to support each other through difficult fights. The coalition became influential enough that districts started consulting us when developing equity policies. We were invited to participate in task forces and advisory committees. Some administrators genuinely wanted our input. Others included us for optics but didn't seriously consider our recommendations. We learned to distinguish between authentic partners and those just checking boxes. Focused our energy on working with leaders actually committed to change. The coalition also supported state-level policy changes. We advocated for legislation requiring districts to report disaggregated data on complaints and discipline, pushed for stronger enforcement mechanisms when districts violated civil rights laws, supported bills funding implicit bias training and diverse hiring initiatives. Some legislation passed. Some failed. We celebrated victories and regrouped after defeats. Kept pushing, knowing that sustainable change required work at multiple levels. Maya's recordings had sparked something larger than any of us anticipated that night at the board meeting. What started as one student documenting one principal's racism had exposed systemic issues affecting thousands of students. The changes implemented in our district influenced practices in dozens of others. School administrators across the state began taking discrimination complaints more seriously. Teachers received better training on recognizing bias. Students learned they had power to document and report unfair treatment. Parents understood they could demand accountability when systems failed their children. None of it would have happened if Maya hadn't been brave enough to press record on her phone and document the truth. If she hadn't organized evidence methodically. If she hadn't stood up in that board meeting and refused to be silenced. Her courage created ripples that turned into waves. I was proud of her strength and glad I'd supported her decision to come forward, even though it had been terrifying. The process had been exhausting and emotionally draining for our entire family. There were moments I'd wanted to quit and just transfer Maya to another school to escape the conflict. But she'd insisted on staying and fighting, insisted that leaving without accountability would mean Whitmore could keep hurting other students. Maya had been right. Her willingness to fight had protected students who came after her, had created a safer, more equitable environment for all students in the district. Maya's now in her third year of college studying biochemistry and considering medical school applications. She's maintained a strong GPA and secured research positions studying health disparities. Her professors describe her as brilliant and passionate with clear leadership potential. She still volunteers with the legal clinic when home on breaks, still speaks at education conferences when invited, still believes in the power of documentation and advocacy. Recently told me she wants to focus her medical career on underserved communities and combine clinical work with policy advocacy. Wants to address both individual health needs and systemic factors that create disparities. I see the through line from that frightened 16-year-old recording her principal's racist comments to this confident young woman planning to change systems. Trauma can destroy or motivate depending on how it's channeled. Maya channeled hers into purpose. She'll be an incredible doctor and advocate. The changes in our district continue evolving. New challenges emerge requiring ongoing vigilance. But the foundation Maya helped create ensures those challenges get addressed rather than ignored. The ombudsman position she helped establish has become a model for other districts. The training programs her recordings illustrated have been refined and expanded. The complaint processes her case exposed have been completely rebuilt. Students who've benefited from these changes don't know Maya's name or her story. That's fine. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because staying silent felt impossible. Because documenting the truth was the only way she could maintain some control in a situation designed to make her powerless. She taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite fear because the alternative is worse. She taught me that students are powerful when we trust them and give them tools to advocate for themselves. She taught me that systems only change when people refuse to accept injustice quietly. Those lessons shaped how I approach everything now. I'm more willing to challenge authority when I see wrong. More committed to supporting others fighting similar battles. More convinced that ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they refuse to stay silent. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.